ado, over to you, Josh.
Well, hello and welcome everybody to Murky Waters of Academic File Sharing. Josh Seelan here, Manager of Library Services at Assiniboine Community College in very cold Brandon, Manitoba.
Okay, sorry about the hold up there. I had some technical difficulties and was trying to find my way back here. Thank you for attending our session today. So feel free to add questions to the chat. I probably missed some of this content that was already shared with you. But if you want to share your questions in the chat, we're going to be paying attention to what pops up there. And we'll also have questions throughout that we'll be asking you. And if you feel more comfortable, you can reserve your questions to the end. So Josh and I will be presenting an overview of file sharing and the gray zone of this practice with you today.
And by the end of today's virtual session, you will be able to describe academic file sharing and how it works, identify ways in which predatory file sharing entities, so companies or individuals, exploit and deceive users, and finally, to discuss contextual factors related to academic file sharing and academic misconduct.
So we start our presentation by answering two questions. What is academic file sharing and how does it work? You'll find that our answers are fairly straightforward, but may lead to other questions that are not as straightforward because of specific circumstances, institutional policy, the COVID-19 situation, and other factors. Therefore, answering the questions about academic file sharing and the impact it has on your students, faculty, administration requires careful thought about this topic in order to make the best decisions about how to approach file sharing in teaching and learning at the post-secondary level. So we'll begin with the definition of academic file sharing. It is the transfer and trading of lecture materials, notes, assignments, and exam questions and answers with other students and/or with internet-based sites. File sharing may also involve obtaining files in exchange for a fee or credits, but files can often be obtained for free. So some of the most successful note sharing companies that are out there that students and instructors are marketed to include Course Hero. It's very popular and widely known. Many sites, including this one, state on their websites that the documents that students upload cannot already exist on the website. But we have found in our experience that this statement is blatantly untrue, and there's usually multiple copies of the same document. So another example of a file sharing or note sharing or tutoring website is Chegg, which has appeared in the media quite regularly through the pandemic. And both Chegg and Course Hero also market heavily to instructors. And this can be quite problematic as instructors are often marketed to in the sense of trying to help instructors reduce their workload in their teaching. Another common file sharing site is ThinkSwap. And the way ThinkSwap works and the way most of these file sharing sites work is that first, the website boasts that a collection of thousands, if not millions of documents to be used as study guides or exemplars to improve understanding of a topic are available to students. And second, to access these valuable resources, students can purchase them or exchange them for uploading new files. And the valuable part might be questionable. Sometimes there's content on here like syllabi and other very sparse notes that are not really helpful for this purpose, but they're marketed to students as valuable. So on ThinkSwap, for example, this how-to page also includes a reminder that students should act with academic integrity. So in the past, these types of reminders, and I started looking at these websites about 6.5 years ago. These reminders were often hidden away on the terms of service pages, and terms of service pages are often shown in light gray small font. But now these messages are coming more to the front of these websites. And this gives the impression that these companies are indeed caring about academic integrity and defining it in the same way as post-secondary institutions do.
So another few examples here, we mentioned Course Hero, and I've got that at the top of the page here with Georgian College having 9,800 documents, and you can see Course Heroes nicely sorted by departments. Down in the bottom left, we've got University of Saskatchewan's content from another site called OneClass. You can see on the left-hand side, it's handy that it's sorted by document types. And then another big one in the bottom right is StuDocu, and there we've got some results from Simon Fraser showing not only document types, but most popular by both course and individual document.
So a great question has come in the chat, and alongside our poll question, we'd like to answer, are students aware that they do not own the copyright of course materials they upload? And I'd say that most people are generally unaware of copyright and copyright guidelines and laws, and students especially might not really pay attention to what copyright means. So generally, no, even though most of our institutions do have some information on what copyright guidelines are, they might not put that together with the information that they're receiving from their instructors in their courses. They may have the view that they are, they're taking this class, they're paying for this class, and so anything that they receive belongs to them, which is not the case, as we know. So here's our poll question, and if you can take a few minutes to answer this: should academic file sharing be considered as a form of academic misconduct more formally? And so regardless of copyright guidelines and the copyright question, should this be something that we should care about and consider a form of academic misconduct? And it looks like from the poll, the majority of you say yes. And our poll is just a yes, no. Your answers might be more nuanced if you'd had more time to, provide some details or justification on your responses. And that makes sense because context matters.
So we wanted to add this outsourcing spectrum from Bretag et al. On the references down at the bottom here that talks about the difference between sharing behaviors and cheating behaviors. So some data about that on the right-hand side here, and this is from Curtis, is that an estimated average of 8% of students engage in custom ghostwriting, which would be when they intentionally outsource their assignments for someone else to do, whereas 11% engage in file sharing. So again, if we look at that spectrum, file sharing is at the far left side of that spectrum, whereas custom ghostwriting would be having somebody else do your assessments for you. You can see also from Curtis that cheating via submitting work obtained by file sharing is more frequent than submitting custom ghostwritten work, so that is consistent. And then again from Bretag at the bottom, that students still primarily engage in outsourcing behaviors with people who they know, so other students, friends, and family. And that's something that we've seen over the past couple of years. In the change in learning environment will often affect the type of misconduct, but not necessarily the rate. So students who don't know each other, who are in, say, an online distance course that's designed to be delivered that way, and that's what they were expecting, may engage in different types of misconduct, whereas students who are used to working with the same people in person day in and day out are usually more comfortable getting into something like collusion, where they intentionally work together when they're not supposed to. So also down here, is something we're talking about called cognitive offloading, and the Dawson reference is again at the bottom. So what this means is that this is essentially when a student does not have to do any learning, when they offload the thinking of the learning to, it could be another person, or they often talk about doing that with calculators in the context of math. And in some of Dawson's writings, he actually talks about doing that intentionally to allow, say, some of the more rote pieces of a larger project to happen. So when we're looking at this in the context of file sharing, then this concept of cognitive offloading really only applies to the students who buy, obtain, and receive on this spectrum from Bretag. And if we're focusing on learning rather than academic misconduct, this is an important point to focus on when we're talking about academic file sharing, hence our title today of these being murky waters.
Yeah, and just to add to Josh's point there, but also the question in the chat, a student asked me this question: why do we get in trouble for sharing files, but instructors do it all the time and they share tests? I was stumped on how to answer. So I think this speaks to, again, that the gray area between sharing and then using that shared work in order to gain advantage over other students, and to try to receive a grade that hasn't really been earned. And I think in terms of answering students, answering the questions that students may have about this, it's not so much, it may not be the sharing necessarily, that behavior, as we know, sharing and talking with other students and creating a learning environment where people can talk about their ideas in order to enhance their learning is important. Where it becomes a problem is when those files or those documents are shared with another entity without the permission of the owner, or for the purposes of reselling it and like keep spreading it, or for the purposes of engaging then in academic misconduct, so facilitating cheating. So it's problematic when students are not thinking critically about how they're using the files and its further implications. So I hope that begins to answer that question for you, and you're better able to share with students the importance of understanding acceptable and unacceptable sharing behaviors. So this leads us to some academic integrity policy work that has been conducted in Canada over the last couple of years. So Sarah Elaine Eaton of the University of Calgary has gathered a number of researchers across Canada to start examining the academic integrity policies across the country, and what exactly constitutes academic misconduct and how we categorize this. And what we can see is that file sharing and then all the behaviors that may slip into contract cheating can actually be categorized differently, or are categorized differently across Canada, you know, from plagiarism all the way to facilitation of academic misconduct that I talked about on the previous slide. So a question for the audience here today is thinking about where file sharing and under what circumstances file sharing would be academic misconduct at your institution, and then where in the policies would that fit? So that does bring us to our next poll question that Josh can introduce.
Yeah, and the question here is for you to answer on behalf of your institution. The policies and procedures of your institution address academic file sharing. So it's a Likert scale: strongly disagree to strongly agree, or somewhere in between, that the policies and procedures of your institution address academic file sharing. And if you strongly agree, I would love to see them, because this is a very difficult and nuanced area. But we constantly have talks about this in our own institution and with others about how to address this. So it looks like, if I'm seeing the results correctly, 54% somewhat agree that the policies and procedures address academic file sharing, 3% neither agree nor disagree, 7% somewhat disagree, and 3% strongly disagree. So in the next section, we're going to present a big question to you: is how do these sites exploit and deceive stakeholders ranging from students to instructors and other staff? And Brenda and I aren't promising that we have all the answers, but we have observed at least 12 ways that this might be happening over the years that we've been doing this work. And we also know, as Brenda kind of mentioned earlier, that a lot of the sites we're featuring here today are legal, at least in Canada, and include fine print terms of service which seemingly communicate legitimacy and a deferral of responsibility if wrongdoing is suspected. So here we go with our top 12 list. The first way that these sites exploit or deceive is normalizing file sharing. And again, this isn't something that the sites themselves have created, but file sharing itself dates back decades, and especially with files related to the entertainment industry, is now deeply entrenched in our lives. So you can see at the top right some icons from the past, like Napster and LimeWire and Kazaa, if you remember all of those. Now, academic file sharing sites can take advantage of this environment. And whereas the focus was on copyright and the financial effects on the entertainment industry, especially in cases like something like Napster, academic file sharing has the potential effect to not only affect learning, but society at large if people are not learning what their academic credentials are supposed to represent. So again, just another glimpse into the volume of what's out there. A search from my own institution on Course Hero brought 7 figures of results. And then down at the bottom right-hand corner, yet another site, this one's called Campus U. You can see that they list our schools for schools that have documents that can be found here, as if they have actually chosen to partner with the site. And again, note how there are no terms of use or services listed there.
Okay, so commercial note sharing entities often advertise that they sponsor student events. So before the pandemic, this came in the form of live events, offering coffee and prizes and beverages, and really trying to reach out to students to create a sense of community and try to entice students in that way. Now, during the pandemic, what we've noticed is, at least at the beginning of the pandemic, is there were partnerships with telephone or cell phone companies offering, if you signed up to use a service of a commercial note sharing or tutoring service, that there would be some sort of a discount on data plans and that sort of thing. That was quite popular in the US for some time. It was very interesting to me that as I followed this way of enticing students, suddenly it just dropped away and I couldn't find continued advertisements or offers in this way. So I'm not quite sure what happened there, but they pop up time and time again in social media. My daughter, who is in high school, has also seen some of these advertisements show up there and trying to entice students at a younger and younger age to partner with these note sharing companies to help them with their academics, even in high school.
So the third way that we find that these sites exploit or deceive is what we call the ambiguity of collaboration. So this is, again, an environment which these sites didn't create, but they tend to thrive in. So the definition at the bottom, again, from Rogerson and Basanta's chapter on this in the Handbook of Academic Integrity, talks about how this lack of clarity on what is acceptable collaboration is what leads to problems. So in the top left-hand corner is a screenshot from a site called Quizlet, which is very popular for collaborative note sharing and creating flashcards. Yet without proper guidance by ourselves at our own institutions, it can also be a place to share assignments, test questions, and exam questions. The fourth way that we found that these sites exploit or deceive is the use of social media. And again, it's not the fact that they do use it, it's the way that they use it. So you can see file sharing sites use social media and its algorithms to direct people to their websites and even apps for Apple and Android technologies. So if you want to see it for yourself, go to Twitter and mention how you don't want to write that upcoming essay, and you'll soon be contacted by helpful tutors and maybe even some writing experts who will let you know all about their services and ways that can save you time and keep you safe from COVID. The fifth way that we have found that these sites exploit or deceive is that they elude blocking filters when they're classified as online shopping. So Brendan, myself, along with Lisa from Red River, what was once college, but now Polytechnic, also in Winnipeg, published this article down here in the Canadian Perspectives of Academic Integrity on how we have these types of sites, along with contract cheating sites and even rephrasing software in some cases, blocked on our institutional networks, the same way that malware and gaming and pornography and things like that would be blocked at schools. Now, the more that these sites market themselves as a business place, the more they seem to elude the manual filters, which then seem to classify them as online shopping. And we then have to add the URLs manually. So as this happens, it of course brings to mind the commodification of education. Again, not an environment created by file sharing sites, but maybe a byproduct of this increasingly transactional mindset in regards to education. Now, the sixth way that the sites seem to exploit or deceive is being positioned as cutting edge. So you can see some examples of how people who don't accept file sharing at face value or acquiesce to vague ed tech are deemed old-fashioned and part of the problem. So the highlights on the right-hand side that students aren't in that place anymore. You know, they want to learn through sharing. Course Hero has helped this instructor embrace that change. And more recently, on the right-hand side, you can see that Course Hero has hired an ed tech critic and fairly famous author to be their VPA. And more highlighted excerpts on the left-hand side about how they're going to advance something called critical digital pedagogy to help students learn and focus on digital literacy and student success on Course Hero.
So the seventh way is note sharing entities post honor code statements and copyright policies in the terms of service, which I touched on before, positioning these entities as opponents of academic cheating. Many of these websites include all the statements that institutional academic integrity policies include, and even using the same phrasing. And they also reassure educators that if they have an issue with academic integrity or academic misconduct specifically, they are to contact the service. So the presence of these statements, often posted in light gray, like I mentioned before, and small font, of course, along with other legal jargon, seems to legitimize the services. But we all know that we don't read terms of service when we adopt technology. We rarely scroll through the fine print, and so their presence isn't very meaningful. It may be difficult for faculty members to request removal. So even if you've identified your own work on these websites and the file sharing provider states that you can request a takedown, it can be quite difficult in some cases to request that removal of an exam or course content. So in conversation with members of the academic integrity community across Canada, there have been varying success rates among educators and department heads and other administrative levels to take down these materials from these websites. Sometimes the request is honored and the experience is very good, and others feel that it's quite time consuming and there's hoops to jump through, and it can be quite difficult to manage that amongst all the other duties that instructors and administrators have in their daily work. So another way that note sharing companies have advertised to students and instructors is by capitalizing on the uncertainty of the COVID-19 situation that we've been dealing with for the past 2 years. It was quite strong in the beginning, this idea that these companies were here to rescue students, and because their institutions weren't actually meeting the demands or helping students through this stressful time. We all know this to be untrue, as we've been working very hard to support students during this time, but we also have had our own challenges. But this is where these companies have been able to sort of tap into stress and the emotional reactions that we've all had during the pandemic. And this idea that institutions are unable to support students are quite prevalent in the advertisements of these websites. So as the Quality Assurance Agency for Higher Education in the UK has stated, an anxious student physically distanced from their academic community may be more vulnerable to SA mill marketing. This is reflected in additional content focused on student support. And so it's really like, trying to take down students or trying to take advantage of students when they're down. So commercial note sharing entities are also marketing to instructors to try to get instructors to sign up for their services. And they have, especially in the early days of the pandemic, and it's continuing, is by providing workshops and resources for events and offering supports. So what I have noticed is that many of these companies now sponsor our many educational academic conferences. And so this might not be a way, you might not see the messaging when you first join a conference and attend the sessions, but if you look at some of the finer details, you'll note that, Course Hero or Chegg or many of these other companies sponsor these educational events. And so it really sparks maybe the idea and conversations around what is ethical to attend and what isn't. And so those are some questions that you'll have to ask yourself and try to decide what is right. So actually on the next slide, I have a few examples of the kinds of conferences that are connected with some of these companies. So for example, remote. At the beginning of the pandemic, I was highly attracted to the remote conference, and I noticed that Course Hero is an important contributor to that particular event. So this way of marketing during the pandemic, but also trying to appear as a support for educators, is really trying to tap into a vulnerability that these companies are taking advantage of during this time. And so this is something to be aware of when you are looking for professional development opportunities to attend. So on the next slide, here's a quote that sort of hits me every time, and I try to remind myself of reflection, to take time to reflect. So we really need to ask ourselves some tough questions about the gray areas of partnership with note sharing entities and whether or not there is a conflict of interest. To receive funds from file and note sharing and tutoring entities where the terms of reference of these companies, specifically those related to copyright and academic integrity, do not match what is happening in reality. And we need to start thinking about the ethics of that. Students are uploading copyright protected works, and in many cases, this is your work. Students are uploading exam questions, your exam questions that you've spent time crafting, or other assignment questions you've spent a lot of time crafting. So are these documents then being turned around and resold to educators as resources? And I think they probably are. Or the reverse, if you upload your content yourself to these entities, are they going to be resold to students and to cheat in your classes? And they very well might be. So Morris and Stommel state, we must approach our tools and technologies always with one eyebrow raised, and also to do our own homework in this area, or connect with people who have been researching this issue for a while and get some more information and some advice about what you might do.
So the 10th way that we've noticed that these sites exploit and deceive is that they entice users with a credit system or special offers. So we've mentioned ThinkSwap and Course Hero a couple of times here, and those sites for sure give you credits for uploading to them. And I saw a couple questions in chat about this, that in my experience, Course Hero will give you credits to search their site, because there's a limited amount of free searching before you have to either become a member, or if you don't want to do that, what you can do is use copyright compliance as a lever. And you know, I've done this successfully, saying, look, there's things on here that belong to our institution. At our college, the intellectual property resides with the institution rather than the individual instructor. So our area has academic integrity and copyright. And that's something that we do, is go on there proactively and go through it and take things down that are violations of copyright, and then process the other ones as cases of academic misconduct. So again, Course Hero, for one example anyway, will give you credits to search their site if you use copyright as a lever to request access to their site. You can see some screenshots here in the top left that Chegg partnered with Verizon, and then at the top right, again with Course Hero, giving you 8 what they call tutor questions for each friend that you refer to their site.
So file and note sharing entities market their services as providing homework help, study resources, student support, such as tutoring. Their marketing suggests that students are unable to provide the level of support at their educational institution that they're looking for, like I mentioned earlier, and that they must look for it elsewhere. So although students may use these entities in ways that support their learning, and in these sessions that Josh and I have done before, we have heard from faculty members saying that, you know, students are using these to help improve their learning, and they're using them in legitimate, appropriate ways. But then there's some students who are unable to think critically about this. And so we just have to be aware that this is a possibility. The other thing is that these entities are good at making nice visual packages, and they look very professional. There's some that look very sketchy, out there, and then there's some that are very professional, and they're the ones that make a lot of money and, you know, are on the stock exchange and, you know, have lots of investors. So when something looks really professional, that can really trick us into thinking that it's legitimate, and students might get sucked into that. And so students might think if it doesn't look sketchy, then maybe it's okay to use this. And that can be problematic for them.
So the 12th and last way that we have found that these sites exploit and deceive is that they hybridize file sharing and outsourcing services. So again, by outsourcing, we're talking about things like contract cheating, like ghostwriting. So when students are able to cognitively offload their work to somebody else at the far right side of that cheating spectrum. So copyright takedown requests are effective against file sharing, but not outsourcing. Both of these, however, can be addressed with education and prevention via assessment design. So we can see here on the right-hand side from Course Hero, which was once limited to strictly file sharing, and now has questions and answers, in this case from University of Alberta, where individual questions can be answered. And, you know, not working at the University of Alberta, these could be exam questions, these could be test questions that somebody is asking Course Hero while their instructor maybe is watching them on Zoom, trying to invigilate that way. And then perhaps more disturbingly, here up at the top left-hand corner is Chegg's Uversity, where in order to help students prepare for the new school year, educators can now sell their materials so other users can access them. Which brings us to the end of our 12-item list and the last poll question we have here. So the question here is, again, on a Likert scale, there's an ethical difference between academic file sharing by students and academic file sharing by educators. So strongly disagree, strongly agree, or somewhere in between. Keep this up for a few more seconds. So there's the results. We've got 19% strongly agree, 43% somewhat agree, 10% neither agree nor disagree, 19 is somewhat disagree, and 10 is strongly disagree.
Yeah, and I think there it really comes down to if you had a chance to maybe type in a response, it's about context, right? And how the files are going to be used, and that might be the difference there. Collaboration and sharing materials amongst learners is good during their learning phase, but not good during the assessment phase of things, because generally our assessments are trying to, or they should be trying to figure out what a student actually knows and is able to do. And so it's calls into question the validity of our assessments. But when files are shared to help improve learning, that's different. And also in terms of educators sharing files, that can be for the purposes of ensuring consistency as well. So really context matters, and how you respond to that particular question might be determined from your experience and your perspective on the question or on the statement. So we're going to switch gears. We're coming to the last portion of our talk here, and we want to remind you that strategies to help students understand this issue that are implemented by instructors must be part of a collection of approaches within a comprehensive academic integrity strategy or program to have the greatest effect. So many academic integrity experts will argue for a multi-level, multi-stakeholder approach to promoting academic integrity and reducing or preventing academic misconduct and dealing with the misconduct. And so in the sections that follow, we tried to organize a few ideas for supporting ethical sharing into strategies at the instructor-student level and strategies at the department or faculty or institution level. So students are asking questions about the ethics of using note sharing entities that also offer tutoring services. So you can see a lot of these questions are, contained or found in social media platforms like Reddit. You just have to do a quick search to see what kind of questions students are asking. And often students, in my experience, students are warned of the dangers of using file sharing and contract cheating sites by other students and also instructors. So that's encouraging. So they are discussing this issue on social media platforms. And I think it's our responsibility as educators to also have these discussions, even if very briefly, in our courses so that students understand that we're also aware of the issue, that we're not hiding behind something. And to discuss the role that note sharing plays in learning and then offer them as much information as we can so that they can make the right decisions when it comes to showing their knowledge and skills in assessments. So something that's quite interesting too is that students cannot be fooled forever. So students will share their experiences with other students as much as possible. And so that's quite good because I think that the messages that come from other students about experiences related to note sharing companies is really valuable. And students may trust other students more than they trust instructors sometimes, depending on the context, of course. So it's very easy to find comments about note sharing companies or tutoring entities on the social media platforms of these particular companies, which is kind of interesting. I would think that they would maybe delete some of them, but they're there for people to see. So I draw your attention to an experience by the third person. I know it's very small type, so I'll read it out, which is also the experience of the first person who wrote in all caps, who was obviously quite angry. The third person says, your company has continued to charge us monthly after repeatedly asking to cancel our subscriptions, and you refuse to refund us the full amount that you are fraudulently charging. So, a student might feel like they are going to use a note sharing or file sharing or contract cheating company for the short term, but then end up feeling like they're trapped by the student, and money and losing money definitely has an impact on students, as they're often juggling their financial situations quite carefully. So as part of the discussion on inappropriate and appropriate note sharing, one strategy is to provide students with resources. And here's an example of a resource that is available at the University of Manitoba. And this this is just a PowerPoint slide. And this type of slide can be used to spark a discussion about behaviors that might be considered academic misconduct, like file sharing, when it goes into the contract cheating territory. So this kind of a slide can encourage students to ask some questions, such as, are these my own lecture notes, not word for word notes from my professor or another person, or study materials? Who am I deciding to share my materials with? What are their terms of service? Are they trustworthy? Do I have to pay? Do I need to provide my personal information? Where will my information be stored? So to try to encourage students to reflect upon their choices and slow down and think about their decisions in a critical way, I think is quite important to helping students make good decisions and avoid being tempted to engage in academic misconduct.
So our equivalent here at our college, we also have a student handout that really mirrors this one closely. This one's geared towards faculty, and it lives in our copyright guide. And what we're asking our instructors to do here, and I know, again, it's pretty small, it might be hard to read, but we're asking our instructors to specify what can be shared, where it can be shared, and with who it can be shared. We also talk about assessment design strategies, which can help to prevent and de-incentivize using file sharing sites. And just to be proactive and plug students into the legitimate college supports, they don't have to go out into the nether regions of the internet to some of these file sharing sites.
So before we get to the reminder of what our poll responses and discussion of our polls, there's an interesting question that has popped up What about when instructors are being observed by their supervisors and they use a lesson plan from a colleague? And I think more information to fully answer this question is important, but I think it's the whole idea of what have we shared with others that we are allowing them to use and then to carry forward? Or what messaging are we sending about what we are willing to share? And then also instructors can ask themselves questions about, okay, you've obtained some material. What are the ethical questions around reusing this material? So I think in education, I'm trained as a K-12 teacher and have taught at various levels, but there's this idea, a common practice, I think, of sharing materials amongst your colleagues. And so that can be quite good in supporting each other and building a community of practice around, improving your teaching and making sure you have the resources and supporting each other, which is quite good. But there may be times when there are materials that you don't want to have shared perpetually. And so communicating that maybe with a copyright statement. If it's Creative Commons, I think I saw a mention of that in the chat earlier. If you're feeling okay to share freely, put a copyright statement on your materials to communicate in some way that you do or you don't want these materials to be shared by others. I hope that makes sense. And there may be others here attending that have more thoughts on that. So feel free to type that in the chat or discuss that later with an open mic if you're feeling comfortable.
And Brenda, I wanted to mention here that Janet's comment here in chat about this being the same premise as with Facebook. I've noticed that in another context as well, that, while we had success taking down college-owned materials from Course Hero using copyright, students who we had talked to about their files being up there in the context of the academic integrity policy being a type of misconduct called facilitating academic misconduct, they couldn't get the material taken down. It was very much like Facebook, that I think once it's up there, it's, the property of the website. And looking back in the chat, somebody had mentioned, as Brenda was saying, something about Creative Commons. I swear we read something, 6 months ago about these sites claiming OERs when people just haphazardly uploaded things. Make sure it's copyright compliant, make sure it's yours, again, fine print. Once it's up there, it's ours. And they're actually trying to claim open education resources.
Yeah, and I think that idea that we are the product, if we can remember that, we might be able to be a bit more careful about what we choose and choose not to share, whether that is in our professional roles or on social media. So it's something to keep in mind, to also practice what we preach and think critically about our own behaviors in a way to model to students and then communicate our expectations to students. So yeah, very important point there. So back to our discussion, or back to our poll, we had 3 questions or 3 statements. Should academic file sharing be considered a form of academic misconduct? Policies and procedures of your institution address academic file sharing, which was on a Likert scale from strongly disagree to strongly agree. And there is an ethical difference between academic file sharing by students and academic file sharing by educators, and this was also agree to disagree on a Likert scale. So we'd like to open up this time now in the remaining time to questions that you may have. You may post them in the chat, or feel free to unmute and ask a question. We're only about 34 people, so not too big. So if you'd like to ask a question, please feel free to do that.
Well, there were a couple of questions that weren't answered that were in the chat. So one person asked, for the document with a Creative Commons license, would that mean that students can freely upload it to a website?
I think that sort of gives permission for others to share and reshare or recreate as needed. But Creative Commons has licenses have multiple levels, and you can choose the specifics of that. So some Creative Commons licenses can be chosen so that you are not giving permission for people to share so that they can gain something from it. And so I think a lot of people think that a Creative Commons license means one thing, but there are multiple levels. So if there's a copyright expert in our crowd, please feel free to add to that point. Because I think people might miss that. They think copyright is copyright, and it's not exactly the case.
Okay, another related copyright question. Would there be any benefit to including a copyright symbol on handouts or documents? Is this even a legitimate approach?
I think it is. At the very least, it communicates your expectations for a particular product, and then could be used later to help you with takedown notices if needed. I think Josh might be able to speak to this because he's been working on a strategy at Assiniboine Community College about how this might work.
Yeah, we provide copyright statements for instructor created materials and materials which instructors use, that we recommend that they put on everything for that exact reason that Brenda mentions. That really helps us when we're proactively going through a site like Course Hero, that if we do see something, it makes it really, really easy to go in there and do a copyright takedown request. Because again, they respond, at least that site, very quickly to that. But in our experience, they don't respond to students who want to take things down, who don't own the copyright, which is fairly ironic.
Yeah, an important point has also been made in the chat is that once there's a digital copy floating around out there, just because it appears that it has been taken down and deleted doesn't mean that there isn't some form of that digital material out there. So that's something to also keep in mind. So it's very difficult to, control this out of control sort of, it seems like this problem that we're going to continue to face is that our materials are just going to be out there. But I think awareness and then education is the first step in sort of understanding this problem and realizing that that digital footprint or fingerprint is going to remain even if it's not there. And that's the case with social media, with anything that we put out there. It's going to live somewhere in the vastness of the internet. Whether we like it or not.
Okay, last question I harvested from the chat, and if I missed any, please accept my apologies and ask it again. But this question I thought was quite relevant to the discussion about the ethics of instructor professor sharing. What about when instructors are being observed by their supervisors and they use a lesson plan from a colleague?
Yeah, so Paul, I did address that early on, and I think it has to, but just to add, no, that's okay. Just to add that this is where, communication with our colleagues is quite important as well. There have been instances where, colleagues have used materials and passed them off as their own from their colleagues. And I think where we really need to make sure that we address this is reporting these instances when we're faced with them. Now, it can be difficult to report a colleague, and so you need quite a bit of support. But if that happens, it's either dealing with it by reporting or trying to find some other way to resolve the issue.
Right. I think the reason why I didn't catch your response before was because I see a big difference between sharing materials with a colleague and having a colleague take one of my lesson plans for an observation, for example. Again, it's part of the nuance of file sharing. I guess it happens on the instructor side of the board as well.
Okay, so there also was a question about penalties for students who file share. And so in my role as a faculty specialist in a teaching and learning center, I'm not part of the investigation and discipline process at the University of Manitoba, but I think the penalties or the consequences for file sharing would depend on a number of factors, and anyone who is involved in cases of file sharing leading to, that are clear cases of academic misconduct can please chime in. But it's really about context, who's affected, how is the behavior impacting the validity of assessments? And then, is this a student's first offense, or do they have a history of this kind of behavior? Does an institution have an educational approach to consequences, or do consequences just jump to, failure in an assignment or expulsion from the university if it's really severe? So really understanding the situation is key. So if there's anyone else who has some comments about this, please feel free to share.
I just threw mine into chat, Brenda, to Steph's question about it being considered facilitating academic misconduct here, which is solidly based on that sharing spectrum from Red Tag, that indiscriminately uploading files without knowing who's on the receiving end and without often caring is different than sending your assignment to someone else in your class for the purposes of academic misconduct. So the kind of indiscriminate file sharing we classify as one of the lower levels of it's facilitating academic misconduct. Whereas if Brenda and I were in a class together and I sent Brenda my assignment and she copied it in order to not do any learning, because again our focus is on how it affects learning, or are the students meeting learning outcomes, then that would be classified as either cheating or collusion, depending on the situation.
Mm-hmm. So there are 2 points. I noticed that Heather Morris and Matthew Carvel, I think, from the University of Manitoba Student Advocacy Office are here. And if faculty from the University of Manitoba are present in the session, if you ever had questions, specific questions about a case and would like to know more about how these things are handled, you can feel free to contact the Student Advocacy Office to get their perspective, because they're really in the business of supporting students, but they can answer a lot of faculty questions about the reporting and how cases proceed through to the consequence stage at the University of Manitoba. And Heather has just put in some details in the chat, so if you need those. There was also a question that came up about student awareness. So I think students are very aware of these file sharing services, but they won't know necessarily that they're called file sharing services. They just know them as, Course Hero or Chegg or whatever appears on their social media platforms. And if they're not following or paying attention to university communications around these topics, they may well not be aware of the rules and expectations at the university. So if you think back to your own experience as a student, did you take time to read through all the policies and procedures in the paper version of the academic calendar? I know that I didn't. I know it's been a number of years, but now there's no paper version of the academic calendar. So students really have to be self-directed, I think, to attend to many of the rules and expectations that are expected of them. And something that's also interesting is students may not necessarily open their emails. And so we do communicate a lot through email. And this is starting to change, as a lot of our institutions have social media accounts as well. But this requires that students follow these accounts and pay attention to some of the messaging that comes out. Last year, the student union at the University of Manitoba did a great job, and they had a social media campaign around making good decisions during the exam period. And I think that was quite effective. Students letting other students know that these issues need to be paid attention to. So if you can get some student champions, I think that's quite key to the success of any promotion of academic integrity at our institutions.
I'll add to that, that Nicholas's question was about are students engaging in file sharing services because they're unaware of institutional resources, programming, and services that help facilitate and aid their learning. What we at least try to do here is not punish students for that indiscriminate, less serious type of facilitating academic misconduct file sharing, but we leverage copyright law against the sites themselves. I remember reading something about coming down harshly on students who really don't understand that something they're doing is wrong. And I think file sharing, especially for younger students who have always grown up with file sharing, those of us who kind of remember Napster in our, midlife related to music, it's a little bit easier for us to put it in context. Whereas a 20-year-old student, that's just how they access information. And I legitimately don't think they understand. But having said that, institutions can do a better job and provide them a place to do file sharing, specifically on the LMS. And that's another one of the things we do here is recommend that instructors do facilitate helpful and ethical file sharing in an LMS, because students are going to do it anyway. So give them a place to do it.
So we are approaching the end of the hour, and we know that you're very busy people and likely have meetings or classes to teach at 10 o'clock. So we'd like to close our session. So today we have described what file sharing is, how companies use predatory strategies to entice students and instructors to use them, and their contract cheating services. So, sliding from something that might be legitimate into something that's not legitimate, and how to address this issue with our students. So we hope that this short presentation has sparked some questions and encourages you to consider various perspectives on the topic and move forward with enough information as you plan your courses and interact with your students. The information shared here may also be useful as you engage in policy review and revision and other higher level strategies to address file sharing issues at your institutions. And you can also feel free to reach out to myself or to Josh at any time for more information or to continue the discussion. Thank you for joining us today.
All right, on behalf of myself and all the participants, I'd like to thank Josh and Brenda for an outstanding session. And you can see that I posted the link to the next session on March 18th in the chat. So hope to see you all there.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks, Brenda.
Thanks, Paul, for moderating the session.
I'll do my best to have this recording uploaded this week and distributed to everybody by your emails.